The silence was a memory, a relic of a time before the chime. Now there was only the sound. It was not a noise that could be blocked by insulation or baffled by acoustic dampeners. It resonated directly in the bones, a vibration that hummed in the teeth and settled deep behind the eyes. On the bridge of the salvage hauler, Straylate, the crew wore it like a shroud. Every surface seemed to shimmer with its phantom energy, from the worn deck plates to the star-dusted canopy of the viewport. Outside, the silent debris field of a dead civilization drifted past, colossal ribs of alien superstructures and the glittering dust of shattered asteroids, all mute witnesses to the ceaseless, system-wide broadcast. Cale grunted, his hand slipping on a plasma conduit he was trying to secure. The heavy cable swung loose, clanging against a bulkhead with a percussive shock that made everyone flinch. He swore, rubbing his temple. "Can't think straight with this ringing," he muttered, glaring at the empty space between them, as if the sound itself were a visible entity he could fight. The captain, a woman named Wren, didn't look up from her navigation console. Her own face was a mask of strained concentration, her jaw tight. They were all feeling it. The closer they got to the source, the more the chime burrowed into their minds, fraying nerves and turning simple thoughts into tangled knots. It was a slow, insidious erosion of self, the infamous sonic dementia that had claimed so many. Only Ilara seemed to draw closer to the sound. She sat at a custom-built diagnostic station, a chaotic island of oscilloscopes, spectrum analyzers, and tangled wires in the otherwise sterile order of the bridge. Her headphones were not for blocking the noise, but for channeling it, feeding the raw signal directly into her ears. Her eyes were closed, her focus turned inward, chasing the ghost in the machine. While the rest of the crew sought shelter from the sensory onslaught, she had thrown the doors wide open, inviting it in. She was hunting for something inside the madness, a purpose that the others could not comprehend. They saw her as a moth drawn to a flame, courting the same fate that had consumed her spouse. They saw obsession. She knew it was penance. Wren's voice cut through the low hum. "Anything, Ilara." The question was weary, laced with a skepticism she no longer bothered to hide. It was a ritual they performed, a nod to the specialist they had been forced to bring along. Ilara didn't open her eyes. Her fingers danced across a touch-sensitive filter, peeling back layers of the signal. "It's not just noise," she whispered, more to herself than to the captain. "There's too much data. It's dense, structured." Cale scoffed, finally locking the conduit into place. "It's structured like a migraine, that's what it is. Random garbage frying our synapses. We're here to shut it off, not admire its complexity." He walked over to her station, his shadow falling over her console. "Still listening for whispers from your husband." The words hit with the force of a physical blow. Ilara's eyes snapped open, a flare of raw pain in their depths. The crew knew her story. They knew her husband had been a signal hunter, too, one of the first to study the chime, and one of the first to be lost to it. He had spent his last days speaking in what the doctors called meaningless babble, a torrent of unintelligible sounds that she had recorded, every last one. "He was trying to tell me something," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "He was sick, Ilara," Cale said, his tone softening slightly, but the pity in it was worse than the scorn. "The chime does that. We all know the signs. Seeing patterns that aren't there. Hearing voices. This is a pattern," she insisted, pointing a trembling finger at her main screen. A complex, shimmering waveform dominated the display, a chaotic sea of jagged peaks and troughs. But within it, a faint, rhythmic anomaly was highlighted, a delicate strand of order in the overwhelming chaos. "Right here," it repeats, every 3.7 seconds. A packet. It's buried under terabytes of interference, but it's there. It's deliberate. Wren pushed back from her console and walked over, peering at the screen. She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. Pareidolia ilara. The first symptom. The brain tries to make sense of the chaos. It finds faces in the static. She placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder. Get some rest. We'll be at the source in 12 hours. Then this will all be over. She gave Cale a sharp look, and he retreated to his station, the confrontation dissolving as quickly as it had begun. Ilara watched them go, a familiar coldness settling in her chest. They didn't see. They couldn't. They were trapped in the same fear that had led the first response teams to declare the chime a weapon, a plague. They heard only a threat. But she, who had listened to her husband's last words until they were burned into her memory, heard something else. She heard a language struggling to be born. Hours later, the bridge was dark and quiet, save for the soft glow of standby instruments and the ever-present thrum of the chime. The rest of the crew was sealed in their sleep pods, seeking a few hours of troubled, dream-filled respite. But Ilara was still at her post, her face illuminated by the light of her screens. For hours she had worked, her focus absolute, designing and redesigning filters, running decryption algorithms that her own software warned were computationally nonsensical. She was not trying to break a code, but to tune an instrument. Then she found it. A cascade of filters fell into place, and a single thread of the signal was pulled free from the torrent. It was impossibly faint, delicate as ice. She isolated the segment, looped it, and played it back. The sound that filled her headphones was nothing like the crushing wall of noise from the main broadcast. It was a whisper. A broken, looping phrase of clicks, resonant harmonics, and gliding tones that rose and fell with a clear, rhythmic cadence. It was not a voice. It was not music. It was something other. A fragment of a word, perhaps, or a dying breath, repeated over and over in the vast, indifferent darkness of space. And in its alien structure, in its desperate, cyclical plea, she heard an echo of the last sounds her husband ever made. The silence of the void was a lie. Out here, tethered to the skeletal remains of an alien station, the chime was louder than ever. It bypassed the ears, burrowing directly into the skull. A constant, internal shriek that vibrated behind the eyes and tasted like ozone. Ilara drifted her movements economical, a stark contrast to Cale's agitated bulk. He fumbled with the magnetic clamps of the high-fidelity resonance probe, his gloved hands clumsy and shaking. They were ants on the corpse of a god, a lattice of crystalline structures and tarnished, unknown alloys that stretched into the black for kilometers. Just place the damn thing, Ilara. Wren wants us back before our teeth rattle out. Cale's voice crackled through the comms, tight with a fear he tried to mask as anger. His breath was ragged, a counter-rhythm to the maddeningly steady pulse of the chime. Ilara ignored him. Her focus was on the delicate task of positioning the probe's receiver dish, angling it toward the geometric heart of the derelict, where the signal was purest. The ship, the Strelate, was a distant mote of light, a fragile haven of familiar noise she had fought to escape. Here the broadcast was clean. Almost there, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Her own heartbeat was a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She felt the chime not as a pain, but as a presence. It was a pressure, an immense weight of information she could almost, but not quite, understand. As she made the final adjustment, a sharp, static-laced gasp erupted from Cale's comm. She turned to see him recoil from the station's hull, his entire body shuddering. He clawed at his helmet, a futile, panicked gesture. "It's in my head," he choked out, his voice a distorted garble. "Get it out." He listed sideways, his magnetic boots losing their grip. His safety tether snapped taut, jerking him violently back toward the station like a puppet on a string. "Cale, steady your breath," came Captain Wren's voice, sharp and commanding from the ship's bridge. "Report your status." But Cale was lost to them, adrift in the invisible storm. He was seeing things, his head whipping back and forth, tracking horrors only he could perceive in the star-dusted emptiness. The mission was compromised. Her window was closing, leaving Cale to Wren's increasingly urgent commands. Ilara turned her back on him. The chaos was a distraction she could not afford. With a surgeon's precision, she locked the probe into place and activated its recording sequence. Data began to stream to her private console back on the Straylate. She had what she came for. With one last longing glance at the silent singing structure, she unclipped the probe and began the slow, deliberate pull back toward the airlock, the tether coiling itself with automated grace. Cale was a flailing silhouette behind her, another man lost to the sound, another ghost for the collection. Back in the humming sanctuary of her workshop, the airlock door hissed shut, sealing out the rest of the ship. The quiet was a balm, but the Chime remained, a phantom echo in her bones. She stripped off the Eve suit, her movements fluid and urgent. The new recording was already waiting for her, spooling onto her console as a pristine, razor-edged waveform. It was beautiful, unburdened by the ship's electromagnetic chatter and the groaning hull of the Straylate. The signal was terrifyingly clear. The patterns were no longer faint suggestions buried in noise. They were bold, architectural, and undeniably intentional. Her fingers flew across the interface, isolating the same looping phrase she had clawed from the static hours before. It was stronger now, a complex and alien sentence spoken with unnerving clarity. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. She knew that pattern. She had heard it before, not from the stars, but from a dying man's lips. She pulled up the other file, the one she kept shielded behind layers of encryption, the one marked only with a date. Her husband's voice filled the room, a recording from his last hour. The frantic, broken sounds the med techs had dismissed as the ravings of a mind tearing itself apart. She played them together, the live feed from the alien station and the dead man's final words. The chime's clean, geometric pulse ran on one channel, while the desperate, organic rasp of her husband's last breath ran on another. Her eyes darted between the two waveforms dancing across her screen. There, a guttural click followed by a low, resonant hum from her husband's throat. She isolated it. Then, with a trembling hand, she found its twin in the alien broadcast. A perfect match. Not just similar, identical. A chill, profound and electric, traced its way down her spine. It wasn't just a match, it was a call and a response, separated by years and an impossible gulf of space. Driven by a frantic revelatory energy, she dragged his audio file and layered it directly over the chimes. The two waveforms, one born of human despair, the other of cosmic loneliness, merged on her screen. She expected dissonance, a clash of competing signals. But they locked together. The jagged peaks of his voice found their place within the smooth valleys of the alien signal. They did not cancel each other out. They completed each other. For a single heart-stopping moment, the two sounds became one, harmonizing into a single cohesive and utterly alien utterance that spoke from her monitors. It was a word. He hadn't been going mad. He had been trying to speak. The sound was a living thing in the recycled air of her workshop. It was a chain of sculpted noise, a cascade of resonant clicks, and a deep, fluid harmonic that slid through octaves with impossible grace. It was not music. It was structure. It was intent. Ilara let it play, A short looping sample that filled the cramped space, the purest form of the chime she had ever captured, now seamlessly merged with the last ragged breaths of her husband. The ghost of his voice was no longer a gasp of despair, but the final, crucial component of a key turning in a lock. She barely registered the hiss of the hatch. The loop was everything, the pattern so obvious, so crystalline, that she couldn't imagine how she had ever missed it. Her husband hadn't been screaming into the void. He had been supplying the missing half of a conversation. The dementia wasn't a sickness. It was a classroom. A brutal, fatal, impossibly alien classroom where the lesson was hammered directly into the soft tissue of the brain. The failures, the ones who went mad like Cale, were simply students who couldn't keep pace. Ilara! Captain Wren's voice cut through the sound, heavy with a weariness that went beyond the long hours of a salvage run. He stood in the doorway, his uniform immaculate, his posture rigid, a stark contrast to the chaotic nest of cables and interfaces that surrounded her. He didn't step inside. She didn't turn, her eyes fixed on the undulating waveform on her main screen. Listen to it, Wren. Just listen. The alien syllable repeated, a perfect, intricate jewel of sound. It's not noise. It's phonetic. The spectral decay is too controlled. The frequency modulation follows a recursive algorithm. This isn't a weapon causing random neurological damage. I sent you Cale's med scan, Wren said, his tone flat. His brain is lit up like a dying star. The doctors say the synaptic erosion is catastrophic. He's gone, Ilara. Whatever he was, it's gone. He's not gone, she murmured, tracing the shape of the sound wave with her finger on the screen. He's just lost in translation. He heard too much, too fast, without the key. She finally turned to face him, her eyes wide, burning with an intensity that made him take an involuntary step back. I have the key. My husband gave it to me. Wren's expression hardened. The weary concern was gone, replaced by a grim, familiar resolve. It was the same look he'd worn when he had to tell her they were turning back, that her husband's recovery was no longer possible. The key? Ilara, listen to yourself. You haven't slept in 3 rotations. You've ignored every hail, every duty shift. You abandoned a crewman during a full-blown psychotic episode. I was getting the signal, she insisted, her voice rising. The clean signal. Don't you see? It was the only thing that mattered. Cale was a casualty of the noise, not the message. That's enough. Wren raised a datapad, his thumb hovering over its surface. A section of Ilara's own screen flickered, replaced by a grainy surveillance feed. It showed her, hunched over the console, rocking back and forth in a slow, rhythmic motion that perfectly matched the tempo of the alien sound. Her lips were moving, silently forming shapes that were not quite human. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale under the monitor's glow, a specter haunted by a signal only she could hear. She looked just like her husband had in his final days. She looked mad. The crew is scared, Ilara, Wren said, his voice dangerously soft. They see you, and they see what's happening to Cale, and they remember. They see you walking the exact same path. The accusation hung in the air, thicker than the looping alien sound. He was seeing a ghost, and he would not let another member of his crew be lost to it. I'm ordering you to medical, quarantine and sedation, until we can get you clear of the chime's influence. Ilara stared at her own image, at the obsessive, hollowed-out woman on the screen, and for a heartbeat, a cold spike of doubt pierced her conviction. Was this what it felt like? To be so certain, so close to a revelation, while the rest of the world saw only the fraying edges of your sanity? The room felt small, the walls pressing in. The med team would be here in minutes. They would drug her, silence her work, and the truth would be lost forever. A half-heard word in a sea of noise. The alien syllable played again, a stark and beautiful piece of logic in a world of fear. The doubt vanished, replaced by a desperate, defiant clarity. Wren spoke into his comms, his voice firm with command. Med team to Workshop 3 on my authority. Just as the acknowledgement chirped back, Ilara lunged for her main console, her fingers flying across the controls. She killed the loop, plunging the room into a sudden, shocking silence. In that void, she looked directly at Wren, her burning eyes holding his. "It's not killing us," she said, her voice low and trembling, yet clearer than it had been in days. "It's trying to talk." And my husband was trying to answer. The air in the shuttle was thick with unspoken ultimatums. Wren had not sedated her. The distress call from Relay Post 7 had interrupted the standoff in her workshop, a piercing shriek that cut through Wren's order to the med team. He had looked at her then, a flicker of something other than clinical concern in his eyes. It was a razor-thin opportunity, a final, desperate wager. He had agreed to let her witness the new case, to bring her diagnostic kit, but his words were cold iron. Prove it now, or the sedatives would be waiting when they returned. There would be no more chances. Ilara sat strapped into her seat, the metal frame cold against her back, and watched the reflection of her own face in the dark plexiglass of the viewport. She saw the same haunted intensity that had stared back at her from the surveillance footage. The crew gave her a wide berth, their movements stiff and guarded. They saw a ghost in the machine, a woman already lost to the signals she chased. Relay Post 7 was a sterile white box adrift in the void, a tiny node in the vast network of human salvage operations. Inside, the chaos was anything but sterile. 2 security personnel, their faces pale and slick with sweat, had a man pinned against the wall of the small infirmary. He was thrashing wildly, a storm of raw kinetic energy. A deep, guttural sound tore from his throat, not a scream of pain, but something more complex, more structured. It was a torrent of noise that filled the small room, bouncing off the metallic surfaces until it was impossible to distinguish the man from the echo. This was the dementia in its rawest, most violent form. This was the fire that had consumed her husband, the same fire now smoldering behind Cale's vacant eyes. Wren moved with practiced efficiency, his sidearm drawn but pointed at the floor. He signaled to the post's medic, who held a hypospray with a trembling hand. "Sedate him," Wren commanded, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "Standard protocol. We stabilize him and bring him back to the ship's med bay." The man bucked, his head slamming against the wall with a sickening thud, and a fresh wave of alien syllables spilled from his lips. Ilara pushed forward, her portable audio kit clutched in her hand. "No, wait," she said, her voice urgent. "Captain, please." "Just 60 seconds." "I need to record this." Wren turned, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. "We are not risking contamination or injury for your obsession, Ilara. He's a danger to himself and my crew. Sedate him now. It's not an obsession. It's a diagnosis," she shot back, stepping between Wren and the struggling man. The security officers strained, their knuckles white. "You said you wanted proof. This is it. This is the signal being processed. Let me get the data." She didn't wait for his permission, already powering on her field recorder and pointing its directional microphone at the man. The device was an extension of her own senses, its screen instantly blooming with a vibrant, jagged visualization of the sound. Waveforms spiked and fell, a chaotic mountain range of pure noise. But within the chaos, Ilara saw the flicker of order. She saw the patterns. "Look," she implored, turning the screen toward Wren. "These are not random. The phonemes have structure. They are repeating. The victim's voice was a ragged torrent of clicks, deep resonant hums, and sharp glottal stops. To the others, it was the sound of a mind tearing itself apart. To Alara, it was a lecture delivered at 1,000 times the normal speed. Her fingers flew across the interface of her data pad, isolating frequencies, filtering out the ambient noise of the struggle, slowing the stream of sound into discrete, analyzable packets. The security team grunted with effort, their boots slipping on the slick floor. Wren kept his hand on his weapon, his jaw tight with frustration and a sliver of doubt. He watched her, not the victim, his eyes locked on the terrifying, feverish focus she possessed. It was the same look her husband had worn in his final days. Then she found it. A distinct three-part syllable buried in the static and screams. A shape on her screen that was achingly, perfectly familiar. It was the sound from her workshop. The sound she had built from the ghost of her husband's last breath and the cold, alien pulse of the chime. It was here, being spoken by a man she had never met, a man light years from where her husband had died. Her theory wasn't a theory anymore. It was a fact. The language was being transmitted, system-wide, a constant, brutal lesson hammered into the minds of anyone who could hear it. The chime was not just a signal. It was a broadcast. A teacher. As if sensing her discovery, the man suddenly went still. The fight drained out of him, his body slumping against his captors. The cacophony of noise ceased, leaving a ringing silence in the small room. His head lifted, the wildness in his eyes receding into a moment of shocking, lucid focus. His gaze swept past the guards, past Wren, and locked directly onto Ilara. He saw her. He saw the recorder in her hand, and the waveform of his own voice frozen on her screen. His lips parted, and he spoke. It was not a scream. It was not a babble. It was a short, clear phrase, composed of the same alien phonetics, but delivered with a soft, falling intonation. The sound was utterly alien, yet the structure, the gentle lift at the end, was universally understood. It was a question. The silence of her quarters was a physical weight. After the raw, vital chaos of Relay Post 7, the filtered air and sound-dampened walls felt like a tomb. Wren had not confined her, not officially. He had simply had her access to the ship's primary sensor and communications arrays revoked, citing the need to safeguard critical systems from non-essential processing. It was a quarantine of her work, a gentle but firm hand closing a door on her theory. The crew moved past her doorway with averted eyes, their apprehension a palpable static in the corridor. They saw her not as the woman who had proven a madman's ravings were a language, but as someone who had stared too long into the abyss and invited it aboard. She was left with her personal datapad and the raw, uncompressed audio files she had frantically downloaded. It was enough. Seated on the floor, the cold metal a stark contrast to the fire in her mind, Elara marshaled her resources. On the small screen, she arranged the three pillars of her burgeoning language. First, the recordings of Cale, a chaotic, heart-rending library of his final weeks. The sounds were fragmented, choked by his human larynx's inability to form the alien shapes. Next, the pure, direct signal of the chime itself, a crystalline lattice of impossibly complex harmonics she had filtered from the background noise of the system. It was the teacher. And finally, the new recording, the clear and resonant questions spoken by the man on the relay post. It was the first coherent phrase from a student. Ilara's fingers moved with desperate precision, isolating the waveforms. She began by taking the clean, lucid question from the relay patient. It was a short, ascending phrase, three distinct phonemes linked by a liquid trill. It was the key. She layered it over the chime's broadcast, adjusting the temporal scale. The dense, interwoven carrier wave of the chime was a forest. The man's question was a clear path through it. For a moment, nothing happened. The signals were just superimposed noise. But then, following an intuition born of grief and countless sleepless nights, she inverted the phase of the human recording. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. Where the waveforms had clashed, they now embraced. The man's voice became a negative space within the chime's signal, a perfect key fitting into a lock. The complex harmonics of the chime collapsed around the human utterance, their intricate patterns simplifying, resolving. What was once an impenetrable wall of sound became a defined, structured glyph. It pulsed on her screen, a stable, three-dimensional representation of a single concept. With this new composite signal as her template, she turned to Cale's recordings. It was an archaeology of pain. She sifted through the guttural clicks, the pained whistles, the moments he had stared at her, his eyes wide with the desperate need to make her understand. She found a fragment, a broken syllable he had repeated for 3 days straight. It was distorted, ravaged by his failing body, but the core was there. She fed it into her new model. The structure wavered, threatening to collapse, but her software, guided by her frantic adjustments, found the underlying resonance. It snapped into place, a fractured but identical twin to the glyph from the lucid man's question. 3 sources, 1 meaning. The chime's pure signal was the archive. Cale's broken words were a desperate attempt to access it. The lucid man's question was a request for more from it. The glyph on her screen was not a word for a physical object, but for a process. It was the transfer of knowledge, the preservation of a state. It was a record, a history, a soul held in stasis. Memory. The chime was a library. A ghost's final will written on the fabric of space-time. The revelation struck her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a weapon or a plague. It was a message in a bottle, cast into an ocean of stars, and humanity had mistaken it for the tide. If it was an archive, a data stream, it would have protocols, bursts of transmission, maintenance cycles. She bypassed the lockout on the main array with a simple diagnostic command routed through the ship's environmental systems, creating a low-fidelity but live feed of the chime's raw broadcast. The crew could have their filtered, safe version. She wanted the source. The feed was a torrent of data, but now it wasn't noise. She could see the architecture. She saw the quiet hum of the index, the constant, low-level broadcast of the core language primer, the very thing that drove people mad. And then she saw something else. A subtle, rising frequency, a precursor she recognized from her engineering work. It was the digital equivalent of a deep breath before a shout. A power surge pre-caching data for a massive transfer. The energy profile was unlike anything she had ever seen, an exponential curve that would peak in minutes. Their current trajectory was taking them directly through the most focused point of the beam. She scrambled from the floor, her datapad clutched in her hand, and ran. She burst onto the small bridge without ceremony, finding only the pilot, a skeptical woman named Jian, her face illuminated by the green glow of the navigation console. Jian flinched, her hand instinctively going to the sidearm at her hip. Ilara, you're not authorized change course, Ilara said, her voice ragged but clear. She pointed at the forward screen, at the serene starfield that held an invisible rising tempest. Veer 30 degrees port now. Jian stared at her, her expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. I have my orders, and my flight path is clear. Go back to your quarters. There's nothing to see. Not yet, Ilara insisted, stepping closer, holding up her datapad with its terrifyingly steep energy graph. The chime. It's not a constant. It's about to pulse. A massive energy spike right across our path. It's not an attack. It's a data transfer, but the radiation will overwhelm every system we have. Shields, navigation, life support. Everything. Jian shook her head, a sad, knowing smile on her lips. The signal has been stable for 50 years. You need to rest. You have to trust me, Ilara pleaded, her voice dropping, locking onto the pilot's gaze. The entire system was listening to a ghost, and she was the only one who could hear what it was about to say. In 10 minutes, that energy spike will hit us. Alter course now, or we won't have a course left to alter. Jian's face was a mask of professional disbelief. She held a hand up, placating, as if speaking to a child. The bridge was calm, a sanctuary of quiet efficiency. The low hum of life support, a stark contrast to the ragged panic in Ilara's breathing. The pilot's gaze was fixed on her console, on the serene green line of their projected course. Everything was nominal. Every system reported perfect function. To alter course based on the ravings of a disgraced engineer under quarantine was not just illogical, it was dereliction of duty. Ilara's eyes darted from Jian's dismissive expression to the main chronometer. 6 minutes. She could feel the pulse in the raw data feed, a gathering tsunami of pure information, a wave of structured noise so immense it would scour their systems clean. It wasn't energy in the way a weapon was energy. It was meaning, a billion voices screaming a single word, and the ship's processors were about to be forced to listen. She saw Kale, his face contorted, trying to speak, and knew the ship was about to suffer the same fate. She opened her mouth to plead again, but the words died in her throat. A subtle tremor ran through the deck plates, not a vibration of impact, but of resonance. The lights on the bridge flickered once, twice, then shifted to a sickly amber of emergency power. A low klaxon began to sound, a mournful, steady beat. Jian's hands flew across her console, her composure finally shattering as every single indicator blinked red. The serene green line of their trajectory dissolved into a cascade of error messages and corrupted symbols. Through the ship's internal comms, a sound bled through, not the clean, distant chime, but a monstrously distorted version, a chorus of grinding static and screaming harmonics that clawed at the air. It was the sound of a machine having a seizure. The chaos lasted for 30 seconds that stretched into an eternity. A sensory assault that left the bridge crew stunned and disoriented. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The klaxon cut out. The emergency lights held steady. Silence descended, thick and absolute, broken only by the frantic tapping of Jian's fingers on a dead console. She stared at the screen, her face pale, her knuckles white. The flight path was gone. The sensor logs were gone. Everything was gone, wiped clean by a ghost. Captain Wren appeared in the doorway, his face grim, flanked by 2 security officers. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. The dead consoles, the shaken crew, Jian's wide, terrified eyes, and finally Ilara, standing alone in the center of the bridge, her chest heaving. No one spoke. The silence was an accusation, but for the first time it was not directed at her. Jian slowly turned her chair away from the blank screen. She was right, the pilot said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed in the tomb-like quiet of the bridge. Whatever it was, she was right. Wren's gaze locked onto Ilara. The fear was still there in his eyes, but it was now shadowed by something else. A sliver of doubt, a reluctant concession. He had quarantined her to protect his ship, but his ship had been disabled anyway. His protocols had failed. Her madness, it seemed, had saved them. He gave a curt nod. "Give her the helm," he commanded, his voice tight. "Give her whatever she needs." The crew moved with a new, hesitant purpose. Access was granted. The ship's primary sensor array, a system of unparalleled power and sensitivity, was now hers to command. Ilara slid into the master science station, her fingers flying across the controls, a lifetime of training converging into this single moment. The raw signal of the chime flooded the console, a chaotic wall of sound and light. But it was no longer meaningless noise to her. She saw the structure within, the patterns Cale had died trying to articulate. She isolated the frequency of the lucid man's voice, the clean, resonant tone that had asked the question. Then she isolated the glyph for memory, the stable, intricate symbol that had formed when she inverted the phase. This was her key. Not just a word, but a filter, a way to tune the storm. She configured the ship's sensors to use the glyph as a targeting parameter, instructing the entire array to listen not for the whole broadcast, but for the specific resonance of that single foundational concept. The effect was immediate and breathtaking. On the main screen, the blizzard of noise collapsed. The chaotic, system-wide hum resolved into a single, pure carrier wave, a clean line of light cutting through the static. The chime was no longer a weapon or a plague. It was a beacon. It had a source. For the first time, they could see its path. It wasn't emanating from everywhere. It was coming from somewhere. Triangulation data cascaded across her screen, the ship's powerful computers tracing the signal's origin, cross-referencing vectors, and pinpointing a location with chilling precision. There, Ilara whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the holographic star chart. A red circle blinked in the display, marking a sector deep within a notoriously dense and unstable asteroid field known as the Serpent's Teeth. A place no ship would willingly go. Jian, her console now partially restored, plotted the course. A tense silence settled over the bridge as they made the final jump, the ship lurching into the designated coordinates. They arrived to nothing. The main view screen showed only the vast, silent emptiness of space, littered with the slow, silent dance of tumbling asteroids. There was no megastructure, no dying star, no alien artifact. There was nothing to see. But the signal, now piped directly through the bridge's audio system, was deafening. It was clearer, purer, and more powerful than ever before, a crystalline sound that vibrated in their bone. It was a ghost singing in an empty room, and they were standing in the very center of its haunt. The ship moved through a vacuum that was anything but empty. On the main screen, the starfield was a placid map of distant, indifferent suns. But on Ilara's console, the signal was a sun in itself, a pure, unwavering tone that promised a destination. They were navigating by sound, following a ghost's song into the heart of a void. Captain Wren stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of iron control, but his eyes kept flicking from the serene visual feed to the violent screaming line of Ilara's oscilloscopes. He had given her the helm, and now they sailed an invisible sea. Advance by 1/4. Wren's voice was low, clipped. Jian, easy does it. Keep us oriented on her, Mark. Jian's hands were tight on the controls, his earlier confidence replaced by a skittish respect. Aye, Captain. Moving slow with every kilometer they closed, the pure note amplified. It was no longer just in the ship's sensors, but in the ship itself. A low hum vibrated up through the deck plates, a resonant frequency that seemed to be tuning the vessel like a fork. It was clean, stripped of the madness-inducing chaos by Ilara's filter, yet its sheer power was a physical presence. A technician near the aft sensor bank flinched, rubbing his eyes. Captain, I've got a flicker. Visual distortion off the starboard bow. Wren checked the forward screen. Nothing. Report, Ilara. What are you seeing? Ilara didn't look up from her board. Her focus was absolute. The glyph for memory was a shimmering keyhole, and she was pressing her entire consciousness against it. The tone was changing, gaining texture. It felt less like a broadcast and more like a voice trying to form a word over and over with the patience of a dying star. "It's not a distortion," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "It's pressure. Informational density. The space here isn't empty, it's just written in a language the cameras can't read." The hum in the deck intensified, and another crew member cried out, clapping his hands over his ears. "I hear it. Like whispers under the engine noise." There were no whispers. The bridge was silent, save for the quiet thrum of life support and the deep, invasive tone of the chime. Panic began to bloom like frost on a viewport. Men and women saw phantom movement in the corners of their eyes. The clean, sterile air suddenly seemed to carry forgotten smells, ozone, dust, rain on metal. They were sailing through a minefield of the senses where the minds were memories that did not belong to them. Wren fought the instinct to order a retreat. His protocols, his training, his entire career screamed that this was a hostile prelude to an attack. He saw the ship's data logs flicker with ghost entries, strings of alien characters that appeared and vanished before they could be recorded. He could almost hear his spouse's voice, a phantom echo of a long-dead conversation. He gripped the command chair, his knuckles white. "GN, hold position. Hold it right there." It was then that the universe bent. A spot in the void directly ahead of them began to warp, the star field behind it smearing like wet ink. Light itself seemed to swerve around a point of immense gravity that had no business being there. A collective gasp filled the bridge as the distortion shimmered, condensed, and finally snapped into focus. The illusion dissolved, not like a failing projection, but like water freezing into ice. Before them hung a structure that dwarfed the ship, a thing of impossible scale and alien geometry. It was a cathedral of crystal, a colossal asymmetrical lattice of translucent spars and opaque obsidian-like facets that drank the light of distant stars. It pulsed with a soft internal luminescence, a cold, slow heartbeat of light that moved through its crystalline veins in time with the pure tone vibrating through their hull. It was ancient, silent, and utterly magnificent. This was the source. This was the chime. The crew's training slammed back into place, overriding the awe, overriding the fear. The bridge came alive with the hard, sharp sounds of war. "Threat identified," a tactical officer shouted. "That's a Class 1 structure." "Unidentified, uncatalogued." "Lock weapons," Wren commanded, his voice regaining its steel. "Target the central mass." "Charge the primary dampener." Full sequence. The ship shuddered as capacitor banks diverted power, a deep, guttural groan that was all too familiar. On the tactical display, targeting brackets converged on the heart of the crystal entity. The high-pitched whine of the dampener spinning up was a promise of silence, the final word in any argument. But Ilara heard a different word. The proximity had done what distance could not. The signal, now overwhelming in its purity and power, finally resolved. Through her console, through the filter of memory, the single piercing tone blossomed into a coherent, repeating pattern. It was not a weapon's hum. It was not a threat. It was a plea, soft and clear, a single phrase spoken across an unimaginable gulf of time. She could finally understand it. Listen. Remember. Her head snapped up. She saw the targeting solution locked on the screen. She heard the dampener charge climbing to critical. They were about to execute a ghost. They were about to murder a memory. "Stop," she breathed, her voice a fragile thing in the sudden, violent certainty of the bridge. "Captain, stop." The command to stop ripped through the bridge's tension, raw and sharp. Every head turned. Ilara stood rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped the console. Before them, the crystalline alien structure pulsed with silent, soft light, a ghost cathedral filling the void. On the main view screen, a targeting reticle blinked over its heart, and the rising whine of the dampener weapons system was the only sound that mattered. Captain Wren's hand hovered over the firing stud, his jaw a knot of granite. His eyes, cold and focused, flicked from the impossible architecture to Ilara. He saw not a scientist, but a mutineer, another victim of the Chime's insidious madness. "Stand down, specialist." Wren's voice was low, a dangerous rumble that promised consequences. The weapon's charging indicator climbed past 80%. A few more seconds. "You can't," Ilara gasped, her mind racing faster than her words. She fumbled with her console, bypassing security locks with a frantic series of commands. Her fingers flew, driven by a desperate certainty. "You don't understand what it is." She jammed a final key, and her private audio feed, the filtered, purified signal from the Chime, flooded the bridge's internal comms. The chaotic noise was gone. In its place, a clear, resonant voice filled the space. It was alien, yet its cadence was filled with a profound, aching gentleness. It spoke two words over and over. "Listen. Remember." The crew froze. The medic's mouth hung open. The helmsman exchanged a wide-eyed look with his navigator. It was not a weapons signature. It was not a threat. It was language. Clear. Intentional. The whine of the dampener climbed past 90%, the final pre-fire warnings beginning to chime, a shrill counterpoint to the alien's plea. Wren's gaze was locked on Ilara, his expression unreadable, but his hand did not move. He was listening. "It isn't an attack," Ilara said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. She stepped away from her station, planting herself in the center of the bridge, a fragile human form between the captain and the view screen. "It has never been an attack. The dementia, the madness, that's just a side effect. A biological incompatibility. Our minds are trying to translate a language they were never meant to hold." She gestured toward the screen, toward the silent, glowing Leviathan. "That isn't a weapon. It's an archive. A library. A tombstone for a civilization that's already dead. The Chime is their last will and testament, an automated broadcast, a final, desperate attempt to not be forgotten. It's trying to imprint its memories, its entire history, onto anything complex enough to hold it. That's us. We're the only ones who can hear it." The targeting reticle flashed red. The dampener was at full charge, its energy thrumming through the deck plates, a deep, gut-wrenching vibration. Wren's knuckles were white. Years of training, of command, of protocol, screamed at him to eliminate the source of a system-wide plague. It was his duty. But the voice on the comms, that serene, pleading loop, defied every assumption they had ever made. He saw the doubt on the faces of his crew. He saw the absolute conviction on Ilara's. "My husband," Ilara's voice dropped, cracking with the grief she had held back for so long. His last words, the doctors called it meaningless babble. The ravings of a broken mind, but it wasn't. He was trying to speak it. He was the first to start learning the language. He heard the plea. "All this time, we've been treating the victims as diseased, their suffering as a symptom of madness." She looked directly at Wren, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Don't you see? If you fire that weapon, you make all of it meaningless. You'll be silencing a memory. It would be an act of desecration, not defense." The final piercing tone of the ready-to-fire alert hung in the air. The moment stretched, thin and fragile as glass. Wren's gaze drifted from Ilara to the majestic structure on the screen, its internal light seeming to pulse in time with the recorded plea. He saw the faces of the crewmen he'd lost to the chime, their confusion, their fear. Then he heard the alien voice again, not as a threat, but as a whisper from across an impossible gulf of time. Listen. Remember. His hand, slowly, deliberately, moved away from the firing stud. He toggled the ship-wide comm. Stand down from firing sequence, he commanded, his voice hoarse. Disarm the dampener. A collective silent sigh of relief rippled through the bridge. The terrible whine of the weapon system spooled down, leaving an echoing silence broken only by the soft, repeating alien words. Ilara felt her knees weaken, leaning against a console for support as the adrenaline drained away. She had done it. She had saved it. Ren turned his full attention back to her, his face a mask of exhaustion and profound uncertainty. His next words were not an accusation, but a weary, difficult question. What now, Ilara? Ilara looked past him, to the glowing cathedral of crystal, no longer a target, but a presence. A voice waiting. She felt a strange kinship with the lonely entity, the last of its kind, broadcasting its entire existence into a hostile void, praying that someone would finally understand. To you, it's a monster, she pleaded, her voice cracking. But it's just lonely. Let me speak to it. The silence on the bridge, once absolute, now thrummed with a new, profound anticipation. Every eye, still wide with disbelief, followed Ilara as she moved. The crystalline heart of the alien structure, no longer a mere object of dread, pulsed with an almost imperceptible inner light, a gentle counterpart to the insistent, silent language that still echoed in the crew's minds. Ilara felt its pull, a resonance deep within her own bone, a call that was both ancient and unbearably lonely. She advanced, her steps deliberate, towards the towering, faceted face of the chime's core. The air, usually sterile and cold within the salvage ships, here seemed to thicken, growing heavy with an unseen weight, like approaching the heart of a cosmic storm. She held her portable audio interface, its familiar weight, a small comfort against the monumental task ahead. With each meter she covered, the subtle pressure against her consciousness intensified. It was no longer a distant broadcast. It was becoming an immersive field, a raw, unshielded torrent of sensation. Then it hit her. Not a sound this time, not a vibration through the deck, but a pure, unfiltered wash over her mind. It was a wave of grief so vast it swallowed galaxies, a memory spanning eons, stretching back to the birth of stars and the first stirrings of intelligence in a distant, forgotten nebula. She reeled, not physically but internally, her senses overwhelmed by the sheer, unquantifiable volume of lost souls. It was the terror of a civilization watching its sun die, the sorrow of a species witnessing its own inevitable fade into the cosmic dust. A billion final breaths, a billion farewells, all compressed into this singular, desperate broadcast. Her knees buckled. A sharp, piercing pain lanced behind her eyes, a biological overload, struggling to process the impossible data. Her mind screamed a wordless protest against the relentless, drowning tide of alien consciousness. Every fear she had ever harbored, every doubt about her sanity, resurfaced with brutal clarity. This was what had claimed her spouse. This was the precipice of madness. She could feel the delicate threads of her own identity straining, threatening to snap under the weight of such profound, inherited despair. It wanted to imprint itself, yes, but not maliciously, only completely. But then, woven into the fabric of that agonizing wail, a new sensation began to emerge. A sliver of relief, delicate as starlight through storm clouds. The alien consciousness, for all its cosmic sorrow, also held a nascent flicker of understanding, a fragile hope that its message, its last will, was finally being received. It was the echo of a dying creature, not fighting its end, but finding solace in the idea that someone, somewhere, had paused to bear witness. It was not a weapon, not an attack, but a protracted, continuous scream for legacy, a desperate need for remembrance. Ilara pushed through the psychic tempest, a primal resolve hardening within her. This was not chaos. This was language in its most fundamental, unfiltered form. The pain was excruciating, but beneath it she began to discern patterns, familiar cadences that resonated with the purified signal she had just broadcast. Her own grief, her own deep-seated sorrow for her lost love, resonated with the alien's cosmic despair. They were not so different, after all, these two forms of intelligent life, connected now by the shared, universal agony of loss. She steadied herself, her fingers fumbling slightly, but her gaze locked on the crystalline face before her. The core shimmered, responding to her presence, to her raw, open vulnerability. It felt like a mirror, reflecting back the deepest chambers of her own soul. The memories of her spouse's final struggling words, now understood not as nonsense, but as a nascent attempt at profound connection. She was standing at the edge of two worlds, bridging a chasm of light years with sheer empathy. Taking a shuddering breath, Ilara connected the audio interface to a waiting port in the crystal's surface. The connection was seamless, almost eager. The device hummed to life, a quiet mechanical sigh in contrast to the symphony of despair now thrumming through her mind. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength, letting the alien language settle within her, not as a threat, but as a melody she had finally learned to hear. When she opened her eyes, they held not fear, but a fierce, compassionate determination. She raised the microphone to her lips, her stance firm, her heart pounding with the gravity of the moment. This was not a test, not an experiment. This was a eulogy. This was a promise. Ignoring the residual throbbing behind her eyes, the echoes of a billion lost souls, Ilara took one last, deep breath, and from her own human throat she sang the first note of her lament. It was not in any human tongue, but in the nascent, newly understood language of the chime itself. The first note left her lips not as a sound, but as a feeling given voice. It was a complex tone, multi-layered and resonant, a syllable of the chime's own language that meant both hello and goodbye, a word for the meeting of shores. It spiraled from her, carried on her breath, and plunged into the crystalline heart of the machine. For a terrifying second, there was no response. The psychic storm of raw data and unfiltered agony raged around her, threatening to tear her mind apart. The wail of a trillion dying souls pressed in, a hurricane of grief. She held the note, pouring all her focus, all her own sorrow for a single lost life, into that one fragile sound. Then the storm faltered. A subtle shift occurred in the torrent of noise, a flicker of recognition in the abyss. The undifferentiated scream of the chime began to coalesce, its chaotic energy gathering around the anchor of her voice. A second voice, ancient and vast, rose to meet hers. It was not a mimicry, but a harmony, a resonant bass tone that vibrated through the deck plates and up through the soles of her feet. It was a voice of cracked planets and fading stars, a voice that had forgotten it could sing. The duet had begun. The sheer cognitive load was immense, a crushing weight that made her temples throb and her vision swim. She was not merely singing to it, she was translating for it, giving its formless pain a structure, a syntax. On the bridge of the salvage vessel, the crew flinched as the signal changed. The skull-drilling cacophony that had been their constant torment for weeks wavered. The jagged, aggressive peaks on the spectral analysis smoothed out. The noise that had driven people to madness, The sound of pure psychic entropy was resolving into something else. It became a melody, a slow and mournful dirge that echoed through the ship's speakers. It was still alien, still unsettling, but it was no longer a weapon. It was a song. Rand stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the waveform display, watching the violent red spikes soften into a gentle, pulsing blue. He could hear Ilara's voice woven into it, a single clear thread of silver in a vast tapestry of sound. She was not silencing the chime, she was leading it. Ilara felt the shift as a profound and aching relief that flowed both from her and into her. The entity was listening, learning from her. It followed her lead, its voice a chorus of ghosts echoing her lament. She sang of endings. She sang of the quiet terror of watching a universe fade, of seeing the last lights of a civilization flicker out one by one. Her own grief was a drop of water in its ocean of loss, yet that drop was the key. It was the shared experience that allowed for translation. She channeled the memory of her spouse's final frantic moments, not with the horror she had once felt, but with a deep and abiding empathy. She showed the chime the shape of a single human death, and in return, the chime showed her the death of a cosmos. The light within the colossal crystal began to change. The frantic, strobing pulses that had beaten like a panicked heart slowed, synchronizing with the funereal tempo of the song. The harsh, actinic glare softened, the sharp edges of the crystalline facets seeming to dissolve into a gentle internal aurora. With every verse, the light dimmed further, the energy receding from the chamber. Alara felt the life force of the alien consciousness, the sheer power that had broadcast its anguish across the system, now gathering itself for a final peaceful exhalation. She was a companion in its last moments, a priestess and a friend, offering the solace of being heard before the end. The strain was monumental. Blood trickled from her nose, and black spots danced in her vision, but she did not falter. She guided the duet toward its final passage, a sequence of notes that spoke of acceptance and the promise of remembrance. She was no longer just a singer. She was an executor, fulfilling the last will of a being as old as the stars. Her voice, raw and strained, was imbued with a strength that was not entirely her own. She sang of how its memory would not be lost, how its language would now be known, and how its long loneliness was finally over. The promise was a powerful balm, and she felt the tension in the psychic field around her release, the eons of fear and desperation giving way to a profound and weary calm. The great machine was letting go. With all the strength she had left, she sang the final note. It was a pure, clear tone of utter finality, a sound that meant rest. It hung in the vast, silent chamber for a heartbeat, a perfect, singular point of sound. And then, from the heart of the crystal, the chime answered. It returned her note not as an echo, but as a perfect, resonant harmony. For one breathtaking moment, the two voices merged, human and alien, becoming a single, complete chord that vibrated through the very structure of space. It was a sound of absolute peace, of a story finding its ending. Then there was only silence. The light in the crystal faded to a soft, ember-like glow and then went dark. The psychic pressure vanished. The vibrations under her feet ceased. Across the entire system, the haunting melody faded from the comms, leaving a quiet so deep and so sudden it was a physical presence. Ilara stood alone in the darkness, trembling with exhaustion and release, her hand still resting on the cold, inert crystal. She had done it. She had brought not just an end to the noise, but a gentle closure to a lost civilization and a quiet peace to her own heart.